Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years' experience with cybersecurity. 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited about this conversation. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, and we were talking before this started about how I was just in Canada visiting and all that kind of stuff, so excited to potentially see you in the future in person. So why don't you introduce yourself, sir?
Thanks, Aaron. So, hey everyone, I'm Raphael Arakelian, and as Aaron indicated, I'm located in Canada. So I work with PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC in short, specifically in the Canadian firm. And I've been with the firm for the past 4 years or so, and I currently lead our OT cyber monitoring implementation team, which means I do a wide variety of activities, which I also oversee when it comes to OT cyber monitoring, such as helping organizations evaluate products, understanding their requirements, conducting proof of concepts, and then eventually implementing the tools and helping them manage those tools or their program. I've had a fair amount of experience when it comes to sharing thought leadership around this. I think, Aaron, we first connected after I had developed a guide for asset owners on how to conduct head-to-head evaluations, and this was a guide that I presented at this year's the CISA ICS Joint Working Group, which I believe is going to be potentially changing names. I'm not sure about that, but so yeah, excited to be here and to talk to you about some of the challenges that asset owners face and what are some of the things that they can do.
Yeah, and it's an exciting space to be. So obviously I came from a big four consulting firm like PwC. I was with EY, but it's different seeing there. So I came from being an asset owner, working at a power utility and really looking at this landscape. And this was before OT was even a thing. Now there's so many OT products. There's all these options that I can choose, right? There's a lot of great products that are out there, depending on what I'm looking at. But one of the first things that I did back in my day as an asset owner is I didn't just go out and buy technology. I actually looked at, hey, what am I going to do? Like, what is my goal? So I looked at the NIST, NIST CSF and NIST control framework, and we went through that exercise and scored where do we want to be in all of these controls. And we did that exercise before we ever talked about a technology, before I talked about Splunk or Industrial Defender or Nozomi or any of those products. I was looking at what do I want to do, right? And with that, how advanced, how mature do I want to be? How manual do I want that process to be? And trying to be realistic, because OT is just different. I don't have a team of hundreds of people that could support this. I had a team of 6. So I had to be realistic in the way that I answered those questions and not say, hey, I'm going to be a 5 in everything, because there's just no way I could be 100% automated and in that way in all of those areas. It just wasn't realistic. I'm not going to automatically patch systems in OT. I'm not going to automatically, deploy, the latest AI stuff. I'm just not going to do those things. So it's really important to be realistic when you're scoring those things and know that 5 is not the right answer. Like, you don't have to score 100. Like, whatever you're going to do is better. And we talked about this before, right? I can buy the best firewall in the world, or I can have a really old one. But an old firewall that's configured well is better than the best firewall that's not configured well.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, the assessments, etc., that's what we see a lot of the cases. Organizations, maybe they're working with a service provider or internally through their audit team, they conduct these risk assessments, and that's typically the gateway to understand, what are some of the residual risks that they can potentially address. So it's very important for organizations to be tactical on what it is that they can work towards. And technology plays an important piece, but as we'll discuss later, like, and as you're highlighting, technology on its own is not sufficient, unfortunately. And even outside of risk assessment, some organizations choose to leverage technology potentially from a compliance standpoint, so less from the risk assessment standpoint. And then you run into situations where you have organizations procuring, let's say, OT cyber monitoring technology, but not really implementing it because they don't have the bodies, or they don't understand what are the blind spots, or what are the challenges that they had to basically budget for or account for. And that's what is, something that we don't want to see in the
Right.
industry.
Yeah, and when you're in that position, you want to know what's the best use. If I had a dollar, where is it best spent? And sometimes that's going to be, buying a technology. Sometimes that's going to be, people or processes. But it's not just all technology. As much as a solution, again, I'm a CTO of a software company. As much as I'd love to get every dollar, it doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense for all of the money go to technology if it's not implemented, right? It's not designed. I've seen too many times in my consulting days, right? Is these companies, they have these capital dollars, they buy these products, and they're not fully implemented. They're not rolled out. They don't have anybody to support them in the O&M tail of maintaining them. And yes, they worked and they were implemented day one, but then nobody picked up the ball and maintained it. So it's like, again, I go back to my firewall analogy. I can implement the best firewalls in the world, but if nobody's maintaining them and people just keep poking holes in them, it becomes a router. It's no longer a firewall, and it's not doing its job.
Yep, 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 yep.
So how do you see end users from an OT perspective? Have you seen that improving as far as the way that they're looking and evaluating before they're just pulling the trigger? Because again, from my consulting days, I saw a lot of people that chose technology and back-ended that into their program instead of going at it from the other side.
So I think that's a great question, Aaron. Honestly, across organizations, I'm seeing more and more maturity or understanding when it comes to evaluating products. I think maybe about when I first started 4 years ago, um, and I'm sure the history of this technology, it does go before that. But even when I had first started, organizations were quick to select vendors just, based on the name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, it's the worst case, but I mean, it's definitely not ideal.
Sure.
The whole premise is that organizations need to test these products in their environments to get a clear perspective on how products are competing against each other, but also what are the things that the products can deliver and what are the things that they cannot. And then the earlier they identify that, the more successful their program is going to be. So when it comes from the evaluation side, I definitely see more maturity, more systematic approach on evaluating products. But when it comes to the implementation uh, piece, I still see a lack of maturity. And
Right.
when I talk about lack of maturity, I mean implementing it somewhere that's a quick win, leaving the product there, but then not being able to keep up with it, configure it, set up processes to maintain the validity of what's being picked up, and then building upon it.
Right.
And that one, it seems we are still a few years away until organizations and the thought leadership gets developed on what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and that's the hard piece. At least it's good that they're choosing in the beginning, and it's like, you know, look at cars. If I need a truck, there's a lot of trucks out there. There's Toyota makes one, and Chevy, and Ford, and Dodge, and all these options. You can't just put them on you know option by option and do a side by side comparison, because it's not necessarily, the Chevy may work for me because I want to tow, or the Toyota may work better for me because I want to go off roading, or whatever that thing is. So just because maybe the Toyota's better in some areas, me as an asset owner, I need to understand what I'm looking for. And having the most features, or it's like taking an IT product that, whatever it is, and trying to force it down into OT because it has all these capabilities. But you're not necessarily going to use them in an OT space. So just because they're better at, active scanning, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do that everywhere. So that's not really high on my priority list. So maybe it's better, and maybe it gets some bump for that, but it doesn't necessarily translate into how I'm going to use it in OT, which is why I go back to really understanding what I'm going to do is way more important before I start choosing technology, so that I know when I'm scoring it what I'm looking for. Because I can say, hey, Ferrari's the best car in the world, but to haul a wood from Home Depot, I'm not going to do a very good job of hauling wood in my Ferrari.
Yeah.
It's going to be pretty awkward.
Yeah. I would like to see how that looks like. But yeah, totally agree there. And the other side, Aaron, in addition to, from the technical or requirements perspective, it's also from the people or, the cultural standpoint, because the more you conduct such systematic evaluations and socialize that with OT early on, the easier the adoption is going to be. And the OT cyber monitoring tools, at the end of the day, they are sitting in the OT networks, OT environments, the people who are, sustaining the processes that which also need to be integrated in your OT cyber monitoring program are OT folks. So you're heavily reliant on that, and that's why this evaluation also is important. It opens the channel for that communication.
So how do you evaluate the it sounds like you're evaluating more than just the features of the product, but also, incorporating that into the needs of the organization, the maturity of the organization, maybe the staff and the processes of that organization, and considering all of those things in that evaluation, not just, hey, this product is really good at passive monitoring or active scanning, or right. Those are absolutely a factor, but it's not the only factor, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's always the technical requirements that need to be taken into account. There's the business requirements. There's other requirements that organizations may look at, like from a security standpoint, for example, the specific features or security integrations. Mostly when we talk about these systematic evaluations, it's from these perspectives that I just mentioned. The maturity of the organization that's conducting the evaluation or is looking for the product will be taken into account when they're developing requirements of what they want. So, what are they trying to address? Is it asset management? Is it configuration management? Do they care about threat detection? If they care about threat detection, is it at the network level, at the endpoint level? And all of those can then be essentially transformed into specific technical or functional features that will be then evaluated for, and as well as certain business requirements that will also be evaluated for.
So in those 4 years that you've been doing this specifically, have you seen a change in the things that companies are looking for, as far as, are they looking for, again, I've seen it a lot where they're looking for a single tool that'll do it all. Like it's the unicorn of I want one product to do it all, even though that seems to be a struggle. Or have you seen any shift in that, where they're looking for multiple tools? They're looking for more than just asset management and passive monitoring and active? Like, what has the landscape been and adjusted in the last 4 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to be frank, in Canada right now, at least with the organizations that I've worked with, the mindset hasn't evolved into what I would like it to see, and what you're
Right.
alluding to is that really one product is not going to be capable of doing everything,
Right.
especially when you start going down into the types of these technologies, whether it's like network-based, host-based, is it integration-based, does it do scanning? So more and more, I know based on conversations with peers in the States, for example, I see, maybe potentially the top 1% of organizations are understanding that they need to complement the tools. Maybe a tool that focuses on asset inventory, and then that's complemented with something with threat detection. Maybe it's network based and complemented with host based. So right now in Canada, that's not not the state. It's still like a one tool do it all kind of approach
Right.
or mindset. But hopefully over time, as I'm not sure if it's related to budgets that the cyber team or the OT team is investing in, but hopefully that shift will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I saw that, my career, I've spent time in OT and IT. And I
Mm,
saw that transition, and even in the IT space, where it went
mm,
from wanting to have one platform to having an ecosystem of products. Like, I definitely want to be able to integrate them but I don't necessarily, it's that I don't need to be a master of everything. Like, I want to
mhm,
go to the thing that does this particular thing best, and
mhm.
make sure that it integrates with the tool that does the other thing I need it to do best. And if some of those things I can have, reducing my tech stock and have, 5 tools instead of 15, that's great. But I don't think the goal is really to have one. Because in my experience, there is no one tool that is really great in all of those areas. You have to focus somewhat in some of these areas, and there's just way too many areas to focus on to expect
Yes.
one or very few tools to be able to do all of them. Like, I wouldn't go to a software company like mine to do firewalling. Like, it's just not what I do. And I wouldn't
Mhm,
expect the firewall team to do asset management and onboarding and configuration management. That's just not what they do. So
mhm.
it's no different than, hey, I've got a firewall, and the firewall does what it does, and it does it really well. And let's keep it in its lane. Now I need to do these other things. Let's go find the best product for those, and let's see how we integrate those things together and build a program around those things.
Yes, yes. I agree. That's what the ideal state would look like. And even when we're thinking about OT cyber monitoring, as I indicated, and we're seeing that shift, there's the focus on the asset inventory portion where
Mm-hmm.
you're making sure that you have a comprehensive inventory configuration management database that's integrating with several sources. But then there's also the approach that the how traditionally OT cyber monitoring started with the threat detection.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two different approaches, and they both have, their pros and cons essentially, and there's different ways to deliver an OT cyber monitoring around each of those.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I keep going back to this. It's tools are great, and but it really has to tie into what am I going to do with it. The so what,
Yeah,
right? I got a firewall. So what, right? If I don't configure it, it's a router. And it's not going to stop anything. It's not going to do its job. And it's no different in monitoring, right? What am I looking for? And most organizations I go to don't even know what they have. So buying a product, it can help them. Obviously, monitoring products can help them build their asset inventory and understand what they have. But that's like step one. Once they understand what they have, then they need to, take it further. They need to fine tune that. They need to go deeper in that stack, and start checking all these other boxes. Unfortunately, OT seems to be a little behind the eight ball of, I've got a, and I saw it 10 plus years ago. It was, okay, we got a firewall. We're done. Like, we've checked the box for security. I think we all know now that's not enough. So
yeah,
now the same thing has been with passive monitoring and some of these other monitoring tools. Okay, I've got that check. I'm done. And we're not. I think we all know now more than ever with all of these attacks that are in the news weekly, malware getting hit and hackers taking down MGM and the trucking thing that was just recent that came down, and they took the fleet management stuff so they couldn't ship things, and all of these things are happening. And they're happening in OT, and they're happening even though these companies have firewalls and they have, processes and teams and all these things. It's not if, it's when, right? So it's not a matter of just disconnecting. It's not just a matter of expecting to never be infiltrated or never getting a malware attack. Knowing that I need to understand and expect, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen, and how do I recover from that?
yeah,
Right? It's beyond just, detecting it's there. But in my experience, we deploy these monitoring tools and we turn them on, and we don't have anybody that even knows what to look for. So they turn
yes,
them on, and they're the great monitoring tools, but there's nobody sitting at the console that's looking at it that knows what they're looking at. So
yes,
all this stuff comes across, and how do you detect bad if you don't know what good is? Like, you have
yeah.
to understand what good looks like so that you can notice the difference and say, oh, that looks weird. Well, let's go look at that.
To be honest, Aaron, even that first step that you mentioned, the asset inventory, I have yet to see an organization that has been able to successfully, you know, overcome that step. And
Yeah.
I'll be honest, even as, we're in the same ecosystem, vendors, service providers.
Yeah.
So, I'll just refer to us collectively as we, even with, with clients we're working with, that's a very big challenge because
Yeah.
the product is implemented. There's a bunch of assets that you can see, but the organization has hundreds of sites, and so you have assets in the product, you have hundreds of sites. So how do you know what you're seeing is 80%, 90%?
Right.
Well, walkthroughs have to be done, workshops
Yeah.
have to be conducted, teams have to be engaged. You have to cross-reference each site, and that's just the first step, just so you understand what the percentage of visibility of assets are.
Right.
Once you do that, and again, that's like a whole challenge, you won't be able to get every team. You won't be able to conduct a walkthrough of every site. So you'll have some understanding, let's say, the majority of the understanding of what assets are being detected in comparison with what you know is out there. That's great. But
Hmm.
then the added challenge, the second step, is then the attributes of those assets, because again, depending on where it's deployed, and even if it's deployed in an ideal state, so if you have a sensor in your individual site, you may still have very likely limited visibility into what those attributes are, what the type of the asset is, what the firmware is. 80% of the time you may not see the firmware. So
Right.
what are the processes then to make your OT cyber monitoring program successful? Because you know if you're confident about your assets, that they're there, but 80% of them don't have firmware,
Right.
so you can't track the vulnerabilities for those. So how do you proceed? How do you proceed forward? And unfortunately, the based on what I've seen, I don't really have I don't have the answer, right? The bulk of the work, the bulk of the emphasis, and that's what I encourage and would encourage organizations, is to focus on getting the confidence in the assets that are being detected, making sure that those are validated and you have processes that those are kept up to date. So at the very least, you're confident about knowing what the tool is picking up, and you're seeing any deviations, then you can have alerting on it. But when it comes to vulnerabilities, that's still a very difficult challenge that, especially passively alone, cannot be resolved.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. Right? It's a collective, right? It's a collective of tools and people and walk downs and interviews and there's no one person unless it's a very small organization. There's no one person that as soon as you implement multiple sites, you're going to have multiple people at the table to be able to understand, is this, how many of these assets are ours? How many are we missing? What details are we missing? And obviously your point around passive, and that's not a limitation of the tools. This is not bad mouthing passive tools. Passive tools are great things, but they're limited by the data that's sent passively on the network. Like,
Yes.
it doesn't matter. It's not a bash against any of them. We have passive in our product. Like it's a limitation of the technology, not of the products themselves. The products do great with being able to figure out all the details they can, but you don't know the firmware, you don't know the serial number, you don't know what business function it serves, you don't know the criticality of the asset. Like, you just can't assume any of those things. So you have to take it to truly get that. You have to go a step further, and that step further either has to be active, or it's going to be walk downs. Like it's going or both. And maybe I can do active in some areas that I'm comfortable in, and other areas I can't. So then I've got to walk those down. and I agree with you. In the years that I've done this, I've never seen an organization get to 100%. And maybe 100 isn't the goal. Maybe 80 is the goal. I think most organizations would be extremely happy with 80% coverage of their assets, and understanding what they are, what their firmwares are, what the business risk is, where do they sit, and all of this around, from my perspective, all of this is around being able to more quickly take action. A new vulnerability comes out right now, and I've seen it 100 times at hundreds of organizations. A new vulnerability comes out on a PLC or a relay or whatever it is. The first step is they're rolling trucks, people with clipboards, walking to every one of their locations, trying to find where they have that problem. And it takes months to get even a baseline of where they are before they ever take action on remediating or figuring out what next steps are. That first step takes 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, even longer sometimes. And that's where the problem exists, right? They could have been infiltrated and hacked and malware or any of those things in that time, and they don't even know it. I mean, by the time they get there, they're 6 months down the road and they haven't even started making changes or figuring out what my next step is to fix the problem, or, work around the problem, or, accept the risk and think, hey, it's not a big deal for us because it doesn't really impact us, whatever those things are. But we're still 6 months down the road from even starting.
Yeah. By that time, like, who knows what the landscape might be like. Things might have changed by so much that, yeah, well, like once you get to it, yeah, it's a already different ball game. Um, yeah, so I think if we think about it just, out loud, um, from the asset inventory standpoint, there's always those those methods that we indicated earlier, the walkthroughs, workshops. OT might have certain sources that they use and cross-referencing. So I think that's something that we are seeing more and more capabilities for organizations develop around that. And obviously the active part can also potentially play an important role. With vulnerability detection, I agree. I agree that you're definitely not going to achieve 100%. I would say even the 80% would be quite ambitious when it comes to that. I would I would say, again, thinking out loud and based on experience, identifying the critical assets that you can potentially scan, whether it's through the OT monitoring tool or potentially the IT in the OT that you might have like an IT type scanner that's
Mm-hmm.
doing that would be would be like the bulk of the um, vulnerability detection that you might need, as in the foundational or the must. But anything beyond that, I'm not sure how exactly the organizations can do better.
Yeah.
The you know um, and it's typically even if the OT, site owners, etc., technicians are tracking the firmware, etc., you really don't want to manually integrate that in your
Right.
OT monitoring tool because, I mean, it'll just defeat the purpose. Unless you don't have visibility into the vulnerabilities of the firmware and you want to sort of understand that, then if a tool is able to ingest your manual data and then flag the vulnerabilities, then there's some value there.
Sure.
Although the process around hundreds of sites is gonna be it's gonna be draining.
Well, and the other problem with manual is typos. What format am I putting it in? So how do I translate the manual data that I'm putting in to the vulnerabilities that are online? Because they may not go to the right number, or they may put a period before or have a space after. Like those little
Yeah,
things become a problem when you're trying to translate and correlate those things to the vulnerabilities that are available. This PLC with this firmware version, but the person only wrote the first two numbers, not all six, right, or whatever that is, and all those things cause problems with trying to map those things together. that can be manual, and I know there's some AI capabilities and ML type stuff that you can do around that stuff. But again, that gets to be pretty advanced, and to your point, it becomes a difficult process of integrating those things. But it's better than having nothing, right?
Absolutely.
So it's that catch-22 of I'd rather do it automated. I'd rather have an active tool that can interrogate that. So I'm getting the same data back every time, and I'm doing it on a consistent basis. But if I can't do that, it's still better to have something, even if it's a spreadsheet of a person doing a manual PM, preventative maintenance type, work order that goes once a month and checks the configuration and the firmware and all that type of stuff and notes any changes. Like that's the way it was done in the past. It still works. It's just not as efficient. But again, it's better than not doing anything, right? It's still better than having to roll trucks when that vulnerability comes out and not knowing, then doing a manual process that takes 6 months. If at least I'm doing that on an ongoing basis, I have a spreadsheet I can look to. So that 6 months can get reduced to a few weeks instead of having to roll trucks and spend all of that time to manually walk all those things down with a clipboard.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it certainly ties back to what we were talking about earlier on. What does, the organization prioritize? Which
Right.
challenges is it, looking to address by means of this technology, and which processes it's able to set up and like to help sustain the technology to achieve their goals. So I think it ties together.
How much are you seeing in the OT space of people? I know you've talked about active and passive. How many people are looking to take it that next step, and maybe not in everywhere, but to be able to get more than what you can get passively? Like they have a passive tool, but they want to add on, bolt on an additional, active component, whether that be protocol, OT protocol, or more on the IT, on an HMI or a switch side, just doing more IT traditional in-map scanning type things.
Yeah, so certain industries we don't see that active side at all, and I wouldn't expect it to particularly change. Nuclear is a great example.
Right.
Anything with time sensitivities and critical systems, critical applications, even in rail transport, very little do ask or would like that. But when it comes to industries, particularly I've seen with utilities, manufacturing, there is the curiosity around it, but typically still with the OT side, the pure OT side, the scanning is typically not leveraged. On the IT side, there is that, the IT of OT, there
Sure.
is that comfort level. So it's not really pertaining to the OT protocols, etc. But organizations that have uh, tested the type of scanning on their OT technology, whether through through labs or perhaps by sharing through roundtables with their peers, they are stepping into that, and they do have systematic processes that they conduct on a frequent basis, these scans to enhance the visibility or to make sure that they're capturing the vulnerabilities, etc., associated with those assets.
The irony is before any of these passive technologies existed, when I was an asset owner 10 plus years ago, I was forced to implement, IT products in OT spaces. So doing things like NAC and SNMP scanning and all that kind of stuff. So the way that I approached that is I built a lab. And I had a representation of all of the OT equipment. So I had this was a power utility. So I had a Emerson control system and a Foxborough control system and a GE turbo control system and all, I had all the PLCs and the SEL relays and all that kind of stuff in this lab. So when we implemented any technology, it was implemented in the lab first, and we tested it, right? So we did it side by side with the vendors. So I brought GE in, and I brought Emerson in, and I brought Foxborough in, and they came in, and we did factory acceptance tests with all this technology and got them to sign off. Hey, the things that we're doing is not impacting your system. It's not breaking it. I'm not installing anything. I'm not changing configuration, blah, 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 blah. Like all of those types of things. And we did it hand in hand with them, right? And at first they didn't like it, and they were hesitant and push back and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, we had it working and got, we were doing full packet capture on all of the OT network, and this was in 2011, and then leapfrog ahead, and everybody's terrified of active, and you should be. If you don't want to just take an IT tool and just go actively scan an OT network, because obviously that can cause problems. But if you're doing it right and you're testing it in advance, and you're only doing the systems that you're comfortable with, and you're avoiding the ones that can't handle it or can't stand it, they're older, they can't be scanned, whatever those things are, we have to get, I believe we have to, in the OT space, get away from active is unsafe. Anything is unsafe, but it's also just as unsafe to do nothing. And not know what the vulnerabilities are, and not understand what the actual ports and protocols are in my environment. Not to mention, you look at NERC-CIP and compliance, and I know Canada is using NERC-CIP as their guide as well, right? You have to know ports and protocols of all of your systems. Like, and being a product that can enumerate those things without scanning, I can only do that on some systems if they have the ability to enumerate. So I can do that on Windows. I can do that on Linux, switches and firewalls, those kind of things. But a PLC that doesn't know what ports and services it has, or doesn't have a way to send me that data, I can't get it. So the only way you can get it is by nmap scanning or that kind of thing, right? And you do it in a safe way. But again, it's out of nobody wants to do it because it's scary. They don't understand it. And they're not testing it. And again, I think that I think it's a great idea for everybody to have a lab, whether they own it, they go to a lab that already exists and they do these testing. But when you're part of that evaluation of these products, you should be testing against your system, right? I as a vendor can walk in and do a demo in my lab, and it's going to work every single time exactly how I want it to. But when I go into the real world and have to implement it on your system and get data from your endpoints using your configuration, maybe it looks different, right? And I would never recommend anybody, especially at large scale, deploy these technologies without actually seeing it work in your space and knowing what the implications and what the risks are, and what are the benefits, and what's that ratio, so that I can choose the right product for my space, not for just what the brochure says is best and what works best in a lab in a safe environment, because those aren't always the same thing.
Yes. And I think, Aaron, you've tempted me since talking about this topic, and I'm very passionate about it. As I indicated in our pre-show, I am running experiments on different types of PLCs, different models, different protocols, and essentially I'm evaluating the scanning from OT cyber monitoring tools to different products. I'm also evaluating the traditional IT type scanning, and I'm looking at both of these from an open source standpoint as well. So, if you have the traditional IT monitoring scanning tool that can do that, there's also what you can do, let's say with nmap, etc. So I'm comparing the effect of all these tools on PLCs by looking at specific parameters, and I'm also comparing that with with the commands, or what you would typically do with an engineering workstation software, because
Right.
as you know, what we typically mention or talk about in the industry when it comes to this topic, that OT cyber monitoring tools, when they do scanning, they're simulating or mimicking packets that are coming from the engineering workstation software.
Right.
So there's multiple hypotheses essentially that's being tested here. One is the effect of OT monitoring tools, the effect of IT monitoring tools in comparison, the effect of open source tools compared to more of the vendor software products, and then the fourth and final hypothesis is essentially is the impact of OT monitoring tools comparable to that of the engineering workstation if you're using a native application. And once those experiments are completed, I will be, as indicated, talking about them first for the first time publicly and sharing the results at S4 coming up in 2024. But I am hoping that the findings that are starting to be revealed slowly will help the industry understand more the sort of the effect of active scanning, and there will be a wider adoption of that technology.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I see that as a great exercise, right? And it's not product A over product B. It's the technology of scanning those systems
Yes.
and mimicking those HMIs and all that kind of stuff. And if we truly want to get to a place where we fully or at least 80%, like you said, understand my assets, my inventory, what the vulnerabilities are, passive alone isn't good enough, right? And active is, we're going to have to do that. If we want to be able to automate it, we're going to have to take those next steps. But again, in OT, we've got to do it safely. We have to understand what those risks are. We have to understand what the implications are, where it's safe to do it, where it's not safe to do it, where I need to do, maybe it's a manual process on some of these things. But just saying no to active, I believe that should go away with, the same thing as saying, hey, I've got a firewall, my cybersecurity's good, right? We have to get past that and move on to not no, but how. How can I do it safely? How can I do it with confidence that I'm not going to impact my OT process? Because at the end of the day, the most important thing in OT is the availability of the systems to do their primary function, right? Mm-hmm. All my OT cyber stuff and all the scanning I want to do, it should never impact the widget or whatever its primary function is doing. And if it is, I need to understand what percentage of it, because it's not going to have zero impact, but as long as it's still able to do its primary function, then I'm okay. Yes. Right. Yeah. It's like, I'm at 78%, of my throughput. Oh, okay. You're not at 100. So you're good. As long as you're not at 100, you're okay. But then the question of the risk tolerance is, how close am I willing to get? Like, am I willing to get to 80%? Am I willing to get to 85? Or do I want to be really careful and say, I don't ever want to get above 70, right? And that's where the businesses and these entities need to understand. But right now, it's a black and white. It's either I'm only doing passive, I'd never consider active, or, I don't know, right? There's very few that are on the other side of saying, yeah, let's go active. I was able to do it. And again, but I think mainly the reason I was able to do it is because there were no passive tools out there. There was no other option. And we wanted to do this and have this understanding. So I had to go active. But at the same time, I didn't just in-map scan my entire OT network. We were very intentional about what we did, where we did it, and we were passive in some areas. We were just feeding spans to it. And then other areas like the IT of OT environments, I was scanning just like it was an IT environment because they're used to that. It was VMware and servers and switches and all that kind of stuff. They experienced that. So it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah. I agree, and I like that sort of reference to the black and white thinking. It definitely doesn't help. It's also important to mention that for organizations that are still not, they're not convinced, or they may have challenges around that and they choose to go around, with passive, it's still better than nothing at all. They just need to understand that they're probably working with more limitations when it comes to visibility, and there's typically going to be more processes needed to ensure the, the visibility of the assets and getting the details and configuring, let's say, the alerts is going to be more essentially troublesome. But yeah, I mean, as long as organizations can understand that, then I hope to see less finger pointing collectively, and maybe actually, since I mentioned that, maybe, yeah, I mean, we already started the conversation by saying that we understand the challenges that asset owners have. So I guess our role is to help educate them, and that we should continue to do that.
The biggest thing I always, when I was a consultant, even now when I'm talking to asset owners, the biggest thing I always tell, because one of their biggest concerns is if I do anything that the vendor doesn't like, they're not going to support me, right? I can't make a change to their system. I can't scan this. I can't change the configuration of a switch and add a service port or SNMB or any of that stuff, right? But my challenge to them is always, yes, you can. You own it, right? I'm not telling you, well, yeah, but then they're going to stop supporting. Again, the way that I did this, and I told you in the beginning, is I worked with those vendors. So I got them at the table with me, and I said, this is what I'm doing. I want you here with me to do this in a way that doesn't break your stuff. I'm not trying to go around you. I need you to do this, but this is not optional. We have to do these things. And these vendors, so long have just scared these asset owners into, I can't do any of these things because my, Foxborough or whatever company, and I'm not calling them out by name, I'm not bad mouthing them, but they've just not been able to keep up with the cyber stuff. And as a product owner, I understand that, right? As a a solution in the OT space, same thing. We can't support every piece of hardware, so we don't allow our customers. We don't support our customers just going installing on anything they want. Will it work? Absolutely. And if a customer is really intent about it and they want to do it, we'll support them. But that support, I can't quantify and qualify all of every piece of hardware in the world, Dell, HP, Cisco, you name it, and all the cards that go in it. And there's just too many variables that we can't check the box and say, we guarantee it's going to work with this hardware platform. There's no reason it shouldn't, but we don't have the bandwidth to test them all. It's the same thing that all these other vendors are doing as well. That doesn't mean that you can't support it. They won't support it. You just have to push it and know that as the customer, you have to force them to come to the table. And we went through a FAT, a factory acceptance test, after we were doing this, and got all the vendors to sign off. Yep, all of this configuration is acceptable, right? So that in a year when we needed to call support, they wouldn't just say, "Oh, well, you changed it, so we don't support it anymore." Right? Yep. We got that, and that's one of the biggest concerns that a lot of these asset owners have, and it's hard to do. I spent a lot of time and effort fighting that battle with all of those different vendors. But I was successful, and it was very successful for both the vendors and us. And again, this was 2010. There's no reason in 2023 we couldn't be doing the same thing, because a lot of these vendors have their own products anyways. They have, McAfee EPO and SIMS and scanning tools, and they have integrations with Dragos and Nozomi and all these different vendors. There's no reason why you can't have these more advanced conversations the same way we have on the IT side of the house, right? Yeah. You can't just say no, right? It's not a marketplace or an environment where we can just say no. OT is too important. We have to solve these problems. And the fact that we both agree 80% of your inventory would be a godsend. It would be a miracle.
Yeah.
Eventually, we need to get to a place. Our goal should be 100%. Are we going to get there today? No. But that should be our goal. We shouldn't just be okay with 80%. I think we're just both excited if we can get to 80. Man, that is a lot of effort. That is a good move.
I agree. And actually, the thing also that came to mind there, and speaking of your past experiences, I think that's a great strategy, involving vendors, having more ownership. But the thing that comes to mind is very little organizations are going to have the individuals or role from a governance standpoint that's going to own that, because who's going to own it? On the OT side, that's not really, that's not what they're prioritizing or what they're looking for. It's not part of their responsibilities. On the cyber side, it's more aligned, but there really needs to be some sort of like a hybrid role or a communication between OT and cyber to enable individuals to basically take the ownership of that kind of investigations, or the setting up of the processes that eventually lead to more mature practices that enhance visibility, enhance OT cyber monitoring.
Yeah, and that was really what my role was. I was, if you look at an asset owner, like at a plant, like let's say that I work at a power company and I work at a power plant, right? Well, maybe this power company has 15 power plants, but me as the control system engineer, I'm just responsible for my plant. So when I'm doing a control system upgrade or any of the stuff that I'm doing, I only care about me, right? I don't have the bandwidth. It's not that I don't care about the plant down the street. I don't have any oversight in that or any visibility, and I'm not in their conversation. So I'm designing for me. So my role in the OT space, and this is the role that I think is missing in a lot of organizations, I was able to fulfill that in my job as a consultant. I was trying to bring, and I did bring, that overarching fleet level view of, yes, you need to get all these things. These are the requirements. And you talked about this early on, the maturity of the requirements gathering for the tools that I'm looking for. that requirements gathering for the OT side needs to have an OT cyber representation in it. So when they're gathering to do a normal maintenance of their facility, they're going to upgrade their control system, their PLCs, their network, whatever those things are. They need to make sure that there is an OT cyber representative in there so they can ask those questions, because me as a control system engineer, I'm not going to know to ask those questions. I'm going to look, does it do what I need it to do? And here's my requirements. And it checked all the boxes for me. I'm good with it. Me as an OT guy, I have these other requirements that I need to bolt on to your requirements. So I don't need mine to overarch yours. Yours are the most important, but you also can't avoid these. And I think that's what many organizations miss, is they're trying to bolt on cyber on top of systems that are getting designed, and they're not doing it from design, right? So when I'm designing these control systems, or I'm designing upgrades, or I'm doing these new things, we need to bring all these parties to the table. Vice versa, as I'm designing OT cyber products, if I'm bolting one on, I can't do that in a vacuum without the asset owners being at the table. So they can bring their concerns and their requirements when I'm choosing these technologies, when I'm choosing these implementations. They have to understand and be part of that process if you want them to adopt it, if you want them to roll it out in their environments. That's the only way, is more communication between these organizations so everybody's requirements are considered. So when I choose product A, it's not just because it does the OT guy's job. It also because we incorporated the other requirements that the plant and the asset owner brought to the table as well. And maybe it wasn't the one the OT guy would have checked, but when I checked product B, it did more of both of their requirements. So that's why I chose that product B.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a different perspective. It's a hard perspective, but I think that's what we've done in the IT space, and we've done really well, is we bring the server team and the firewall team and the network team and the cyber team, and they're all at the same table. So when they're writing those requirements, everybody has their perspective. You can't expect the cyber guy to understand the hardware requirements of the server, so you bring the server guy, and the same with the firewall and throughput and scanning and vulnerabilities, and you bring all those people to the table. But in OT, usually we have one person, and we expect that one person to know it all. And unfortunately, it's going to fall short most of the time.
Yeah. It's too much of a burden to be able to, take care of the technology parts, but also influence on both sides the culture to be able to have a successful, OT cyber program.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's just like the software we talked about. Like, I can't expect one tool to do everything. I can't expect one person to do everything either, right? At some point, I've got a lot of experience in my past, and I think I can do a lot of different things, and I'm pretty good in a lot of different areas. But would I say I'm the most expert in all of those fields? Of course not. There's no way I could be. There's no way that I'm going to be the best firewall guy in the world. I'm pretty good at it, but if somebody that's all they do, they're going to be better at it than me, right? Just because that's what they're focused on. And I have to focus at a higher level. There's no way I can be that deep in the weeds in every capability, in monitoring and scanning and asset management, configuration management, firewalls, networking, like all of these VMware, like application layer, like all of those things. You need to bring in all of those different perspectives to make sure that you have a well-rounded approach to all the things that you're trying to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So what is the next 5 to 10 years? What is something that you see that you're excited about, and maybe something that you see on the horizon that may be concerning, again, in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think we may have kind of lightly touched on this. So I guess we'll have the opportunity to discuss it a bit more. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to see a couple of things. One, there will be a stronger shift or emphasis on products that have decoupled threat detection from OT cyber monitoring. In other words, what we identified earlier as the tools that are focusing on the asset inventorying, developing CMDBs, etc. So there's going to be an emphasis on that type of approach, on getting the asset inventory right. But then the other thing that we will see is that shift in terms of leveraging different types of approaches or different types of technologies to set up a successful OT cyber monitoring program. So where applicable, network-based monitoring is going to be leveraged. Where applicable, host-based monitoring is going to be leveraged. Industries or systems that are capable of scanning, we will see more and more adoption of that type of methodology, and essentially there will be an increased maturity in how OT cyber monitoring is going to be done. There's no doubt about that. That's just
Sure.
how history has proven in general across any cyber technology or practices. And so it's really a question of when and how that's going to happen, but that's what I'm most excited for. The other thing that we're also seeing is more of the OEMs, manufacturers also adopting, the importance of OT cyber monitoring. Some of them are investing in organizations or, in tech products that deliver that, and some, will even be more open on how to leverage that on their system. So very different case, for example, from what you had to experience 10 years ago.
Right.
So yeah, those I would say are the key points that I foresee from my personal experience.
Excellent. Yeah, that's the way. I agree. That's the way we're going to go. We have to go. That's the way it's going to have to be, to get where we need to be. And it's too important not to. And I see traction, and I see direction, and I see more willingness to have those conversations, and more organizations, both large and small. I think we all have seen, just like firewalls, that passive is great. It's just not enough. We've got to do more. We've got to continue to move the ball. And cyber is a never-ending target. There is no finish line where I do all step 1 through 10 and then I'm done. Like I can just walk away. It's the analogy I gave earlier, right? It's like going to the gym. I can't just go twice and then never go again, because I'll lose all my progress. I've got to continue to go if I want to maintain and be healthy and all those types of things. So I agree 100%. So, well, awesome, sir. I look forward to seeing you in person and hearing your findings at S4. Is there any actions or call to action for anybody in the audience to check you out or find out about you?
Well, I mean, in terms of checking out, there's always my LinkedIn, which is my name, but I would say the real call to action is essentially to reflect on some of these things that we discussed today. And surprisingly, although we focused, on the technology side and the processes, I think one of the key takeaways is also the importance of setting up OT cyber steering committees where everyone from the table is essentially, they have a representation at the table, and that's going to play a very important role in evaluating products and, conducting proof of concepts, implementing the products, sustaining them, figuring out what the processes are, what are the limitations, and, sustaining the program. So I would say that's the key takeaway that I would like the audience to take from today.
And check out his talk at S4 that's coming up in it's in March this year, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Very, very excited for that as well.
Me as well. Well, awesome, sir. I really appreciate the time. I enjoyed the conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.